on the line as well. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is so wonderful to be with you all once again after a meaningful summer break in Israel. Rosh Hashanah is not for another month, but this will be my second year now, starting this Shabbat, as the student rabbi here at HaYam, at least in our physical sanctuary. I did start slightly before we came back to our building. While I was away this summer, we began the book of Deuteronomy, the bulk of which is an address from Moses to the Israelites on the eastern banks of the Jordan River. Deuteronomy often repeats things that we heard in earlier books, and there's a reason that Moses does this. Sometimes it's slightly different information, presented in a different way, or he may be saying it because some of the people he's saying it to weren't there when he said it the first time. Lots of years have gone by, people have passed away, people have been born. One of the things that he repeated last week, if we were to have services here, which we didn't, was the 10 Commandments. But it's actually not the only thing that he said last week that we might know. He said the words of the Shema and the words of the Ve'ahavta. And these words have not been found in earlier books. The people are hearing it for the first time. The Shema is a prayer in our Sidurs that we know so well, many of us. But the writers of the Torah, people who edited it, did not intend it to be a prayer. In fact, the three paragraphs of the Shema are not consecutive. They are lifted from three very separate places in the Torah. While the first paragraph, the Ve'ahavta, was last week, the second paragraph is in this week's Torah portion, Parashat Ekev. While many Jews can chant the Ve'ahavta either by heart or with the use of a Sidur, most of us are not used to reciting the second paragraph of the Shema, which comes this week, which we'll hear tomorrow. And the reason they don't know it so well is because you can't get used to the way it sounds when you read it silently, which is how we do it. In fact, many congregations, in particular Reformed congregations, don't even print it in their Sidurim. And that's not something that we do here. We do have it in our Sidurim, but we still say it silently. And I know many people who are conservative that don't read it. And when it's time to read this paragraph silently, they just wander off or prefer to skip ahead. And I understand why people don't enjoy reading this. It doesn't usually bring a smile to people's faces. Still, it is in this week's Parsha, so we're going to take a look at it tonight. This paragraph, the second paragraph of the Shema, is in essence a contract. It says that if we follow the mitzvot, then the land that God is giving to us, Canaan, now known as Israel, will be blessed with rain and abundant harvest. We will eat and be satisfied, and our lives will be good. But if we don't follow the commandments, and this is the part that not everybody loves, if we worship other gods in particular, then Hashem's wrath will be upon us. God will close the heavens and stop the rain. Nothing will grow. And we will be banished. We will disappear from the land that God gave to us. Well, God, did we do something bad? Because here in California, it's pretty dry all the time. But no, in the Torah, it's pretty clear that Moses only meant these words for the inhabitants of Israel. But we don't live in Israel, and we could if we wanted to. We have Israel now, but we choose to live in the diaspora. So choosing to live here, is that reason enough to skip this paragraph every day when we recite the Shema? I don't think so, because even if it was originally meant for those who live in Israel, when it became part of our Siddur, the context became more universal. It still applies to our lives today. In fact, the verse before this paragraph in the Torah, Deuteronomy 11:12, which isn't part of the Shema, but gives the context to the Shema that comes next, says that God's eye is always watching Israel. God always is paying attention to everything. God is everywhere. But especially God pays attention to the actions and events happening in Israel. As our Christian brothers and sisters like to sing, He sees us when we're sleeping. He knows when we're awake. He knows if we've been bad or good. So be good for goodness sake. Is this the kind of God, reward and punishment, that inspires love? Many people say no, and I would have to agree with them. The fact is, many people don't like this section because it just doesn't go down very smoothly. There's a lot of doom and gloom for us to read it out loud regularly, and it's no coincidence that we read it silently. The idea that God knows all of our actions and will reward and punish us accordingly for them is also central to the High Holy Day liturgy, but we only read those prayers once or twice a year, 3 times maybe. This paragraph of the Shema is supposed to be read silently every day, actually multiple times a day. But the Ve'ahavta, that is something we read aloud. It tells us to love God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our being, to teach the mitzvot to our children at all times, and to put the reminders of these mitzvot on our hands, above our eyes, and upon our doorposts and gates. And it says all of these things without being the slightest bit negative. These are words of honey. The second paragraph of the Shema, this week in the Torah portion we have Ekev, it says many of the same details as the Ve'ahavta. In fact, it often repeats phrases word for word. It has almost everything the Ve'ahavta has, but it has more. And that changes the context. It adds reward and punishment. Moses tells the Israelites these things to scare them into obedience. But as the saying goes, you catch more flies with honey than we do with vinegar. Negative consequences can scare you into obedience, but they can't make you love God. They can only make you obey God. And it does say in this paragraph that we should love God. If the goal of the second paragraph is to get us to love God, then I think it fails. But that's not the goal. It's trying to impart something else. Mark Brettler, very famous professor of Jewish literature and biblical studies, often points out a key difference between these paragraphs. The Hebrew words of the Ve'ahavta often end with the suffix cha, meaning your, singular. It's addressed to each Israelite individually. But the second paragraph often ends words in chem, meaning it's addressed to the Israelites as a group, the entire people. Everyone loves in their own way as individuals, but this paragraph is less about loving as individuals and more about how the group should act as a whole. Professor Brettler also highlights that the words in these paragraphs that are in common are often not found anywhere else in the entire Torah. And these phrases in common have to do with one thing primarily, teaching. To me, the first paragraph, the Ve'ahavta, which we know and recite often, and is often more beloved, tells us to love and to teach. The second paragraph, which is less beloved, tells us why we love and why we teach. It is about consequences, don't get me wrong, but the real consequence is not drought, it's not famine, and it's not exile from the land either. It's the threat of Judaism dying out. If we don't teach Judaism to our children, then we as a people aren't going to endure. Why do we bother teaching these things to our children, which is in the Ve'ahavta and the second paragraph? We do it so we endure. If all we want is to love God and to be Jewish during our own lifetimes, then why would we be asked, as the Shema tells us, to wear tefillin and tzitzit, or to put a mezuzah on our doors? We don't need those as reminders that we're Jewish. We already know. In fact, a mezuzah on your door labels your household's inhabitants as Jewish so overtly that some people are afraid to put it up because they don't want to be victims of anti-Semitic acts. But many of us do it anyway. We put it up. Why? Pride, and also to teach these things to our children and make them proud. These symbols mark us as different. And let's face it, they look kind of strange. The mezuzah, the tzitzit, they're regular to us because we know them, but to a stranger, they look strange. And they are strange for a reason. We want them to look strange. This is teaching 101. If things look strange, children will be curious. If children are curious, they will want to ask questions. They will want to learn. They will be eager to learn. Instead of having us jam Judaism down their throats, they will come to us with their questions, and we will be able to teach them. As a Hebrew school teacher, and also as a young person, I've seen that in the newer generations of today, telling kids that they should be Jewish simply because their ancestors were Jewish is a nice thought that they just don't always agree with. And they don't have to be Jewish if they don't want to in the end, but just because you send your children to Hebrew school doesn't mean anymore that they will end up being Jewish. You have to teach them the right way. They can choose to live their lives however they end up doing it. Religious living is not for everybody, Nothing wrong with that. But if enough people decide they don't want to do it, then we will die out. And so, if the continuity of Judaism is something that matters to us, we need to be the most inspiring teachers possible. And being a teacher doesn't require you to have kids or even knowledge. It's as simple as being a Jewish ambassador, putting up that mezuzah, wearing those tefillin or those tzitzit, showing your love for Judaism. It's a lesson that can be taught without any words. Sometimes when we teach Judaism to our children, we only highlight the good things. We show them the things that we are proudest of, and we hide the parts that we don't like. That works pretty well with younger kids. But as they get older, and in particular, when people train for their Bnei Mitzvah, they will learn things about Judaism, inevitably, that make them question their faith. And when that happens, we reach a critical point. Are they going to stay or are they going to go? It's up to them. But our role as teachers can influence what they choose sometimes. What happens when somebody who has never seen the second paragraph of the Shema sees it for the first time in their Siddur, and there is nobody there to answer their questions about it? Well, it can drive them away, that negativity, from their pride in their religion. I've seen it happen with negative prayers and Torah verses many times. If you don't like something that Judaism says, question it. I encourage everyone to question things. Questioning is a very Jewish thing to do. And if you tell people that they can question what they don't like, and that in itself is Jewish, well, that makes them prouder to be Jewish, or at least less ashamed when they read something they don't love. Imagine if you taught your child to be a proud American, and you only taught them the parts of history that you loved. You neglected to mention things like slavery. You don't have to like these periods or these prayers or these verses, but you still need to know that they exist. And so we have the second paragraph of the Shema. Unlike the Reform movement, we do keep it in our Siddurs, and some Reform congregations are actually putting it back in their Siddurs, which is pretty significant if you ask me. And so tomorrow morning, we're going to do something pretty unusual. We're going to read the second paragraph of the Shema with our normal recitation of the Shema. We're going to do it in English, so we can all hear the words. And then later in the service tomorrow, I will chant it in Hebrew from the Torah scroll. It's a blessing to hear these words. You don't have to love all of them. You don't have to agree with all of them. But I hope you can find meaning in parts of it. Reward and punishment might not always be so fun to read about, but it does teach us what we have to lose. What we have to lose if we don't teach. May we always be proud Jews. May we always teach what we know. May we always want to know more. May we never lose the Jewish people. Am Yisrael Chai. Shabbat Shalom.